start that now so I don't forget about it. And then this will be archived. I don't know, how long should we wait for people? What do you guys think?
It's up to you, maybe.
I guess it is up to me. I guess, well, we can make it a collective decision. Let's wait for 2 more minutes and then
Okay.
Nobody's here in 2 minutes. We'll go ahead and get started. They can come into the action as it begins. Jeff, where are you? Down in Manhattan?
I teach in Manhattan. I live in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn, okay.
Yeah, our college is located in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in New York City, and none of the students or faculty members live nearby.
Everybody commutes in.
Everybody travels.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Feels like that's the way we are up here in New Paltz, but I know the situation is more dire in Manhattan.
Yeah. Tribeca is a world by itself.
Yeah.
Not when the college was built. I mean, I think it was kind of nowheresville when they built the college, but the big development boom happened in the 80s.
But there's some big controversy down there about splitting up some of the big lofts. Is that what I read in the paper?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, you don't
That
know?
could be.
Some sort of housing issue. Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? And if we're lucky, we'll get 1 or 2 people that'll come in and join us here. But I'll make a formal introduction of everybody so we can kind of cut this on the tape and put it in, and then we'll go ahead and go in executive order. So this is the New York State Political Science Association 2021 conference. This is Political Theory Panel 2, Topics in Political Theory. In this panel, we're going to hear from Jeffrey Kurtz from the Borough of Manhattan Community College. We're going to hear from Nader Sadr from Hunter College and Joanne Tetlow from Marymount University, in that order. At the end of their presentations, I'll have some remarks for each of the discussants, and then we'll open up the floor to discussions between one another and any people who want to ask questions from the audience. And normally in one of these sort of situations, the job of the panel chair is to link the papers together in some sort of way. But as you can tell from the title for this panel, Topics in Political Theory, that would be a high bar to meet. And I'm not going to attempt to do it here in my introduction. I will say that the papers were all very interesting. I appreciate the fact that the panelists all got me the papers a week in advance. That was very nice. Actually a pretty rare thing at conferences, I think, to get everything together in advance so you have a chance to read them and think about them. So that was pleasurable for both of the reasons, being able to read the papers and getting them in time to actually read and substantively comment on. So thank you, panelists, for that. With that introduction, let's go ahead and start in the order that I initially said, alphabetically. So Jeffrey Kurtz, his paper is called Maybe Even Souls, Michael Walzer and the Moral Basis of Socialism. Take it away, Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. You guys can hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I want to say before I begin, the origin of my paper is that Michael Walzer was the political theorist who, when I was in college and afterwards, got me interested in studying political theory in the first place. And there was a period of a few years when I was not thinking so much about his work anymore, but then over the past several years, I've returned to it. And this paper is part of an effort over the past few years to try to sort out both why his writings are so important to me and have been so formative in how I think about politics and political theory, and also what I feel to be, or what I see as the limits or the gaps in his thought. So the specific puzzle that I take up in this paper is that Michael Walzer is what we could call an ethical socialist. He's someone who writes about democratic left politics in a way that depends on ideas and values and principles, rather than the sort of historicism or social analysis that we'd associate with the Marxist tradition. He's an ethical socialist, but he doesn't write, or hardly ever writes, about what you might call the moral basis of socialism, the foundations of the principles of equality and solidarity, or the reasons why one might commit to those values in the first place. He's an ethical socialist who doesn't write about the fundamentals of socialist ethics. That's the puzzle. However, I think that Walzer implies, evokes, intimates things that he doesn't say outright. And that's what I try to explore in this paper. I think that some of the things that he implies would enrich his political project if they're brought to the forefront. So I want to talk a little bit about Walzer's stated reasons for not writing about the foundations of political ethics and about the alternative stance that I see implied in his writings. His argument is, across a number of works, and he's elaborated this idea in a number of ways, as any of you who've read his works are probably aware. His argument is that when political theorists appeal to foundational concepts, it's usually as a warrant for authority for their arguments. If I have an argument about justice that is grounded in the proper foundation, then my argument is ostensibly unassailable. That's, I think, a pretty common move in Anglo-American normative political theory in the 70s and 80s. He associates this idea with people like John Rawls, Dworkin, Nozick, et cetera. And those are some of his major interlocutors in the 70s and 80s. Walzer's argument is that that appeal to authority is incompatible with pluralist and democratic politics. It's an overambitious role for a political theorist to take, to claim that sort of authority. So one place that he develops this idea a bit is in the early pages of his book Spheres of Justice, his 1983 work on distributive justice. He argues there that, he doesn't quite put it in these terms, this is a paraphrase, but he argues that a political anthropology or a political theory grounded in a notion of human nature has to incorporate a strong sense of human difference and plurality. It can't have a precisely articulated, simple theory of human nature or a simple anthropology. It needs to be an open-ended, uncompletable, not just incomplete, but uncompletable sense of human nature. So he writes, for example, and there are going to be some elisions in my quotation here, but he writes, "By virtue of what characteristic are we equal? I don't know. But this question is more plausibly answered with a list than with a single word or phrase. The answer has to do with our recognition of one another as human beings, members of the same species, and what we recognize are bodies and minds and feelings and hopes and maybe even souls." So one point that Walzer is making here, I think, is that this mutual recognition of status as human being requires the recognition of one another by many different people, because the list of things that we recognize is complex. It's a list, first of all, and a list implies that you could add 3 or 4 more things to the list. The things on his list are qualitatively different from one another. It's a lot easier to recognize a human body than to recognize a human mind. And I think that hopes are even harder to recognize than minds. We could, talk about the differences within that list, but the implication is that all of us from different perspectives need to be involved in that work of mutual recognition. His implication, I think, is that if there were a single feature of human nature relevant to political theory, then we would only need one recognizing authority, and that political theories that point toward political singularity, whether that's Plato's philosopher king or a modern concept like Lenin's vanguard party, political theories that point toward political singularity tend to depend on simple and singular conceptions of human nature. So this pluralistic, open-ended conception of human nature is alternative. So that much is, I think, familiar to many people who've read Walzer. But what I want to point out, what I think has maybe gotten less attention, is the implications of this phrase, maybe even souls. It's interesting that he doesn't simply write souls at the end of his list. He doesn't even write maybe souls, which would imply, I guess, a kind of tentativeness or uncertainty. He says maybe even souls. To my ear, at least, there's a pretty big difference between maybe even and maybe. Maybe even suggests a hope or a reach or a stretch, something that's at the limits of what might be. I'm not sure. It's not a precise phrase, but that's exactly why it's interesting. So to think a bit about what that maybe even might mean or why it might be significant, I want to turn to another work of Walzer's that follows from Spheres of Justice. After he published Spheres of Justice in 1983, much of his writing over the next decade or so consisted of elaborating some of the ideas in that book, or refining some of the ideas in that book and responding to critics. And that period of his writings is capped by his 1994 book, Thick and Thin: Moral Argument at Home and Abroad. And in that book, Walzer distinguishes between what he calls thick and particular arguments about morality and justice, or thin and universal arguments about morality and justice. The thick ones, of course, are the ones he prefers. A thick and particular argument in his account is socially and culturally specific. The authority of a political argument comes, he says, in this book and in others in this decade, not from some unassailable foundation for the argument, but rather from the fact that the values on which the argument is based are shared by a particular society. And therefore, those arguments have authority to the members of that society within that society. That's a thick and particular account of justice. He gets the terms thick and thin from his friend and colleague Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist who wrote about thick description and thin description. In origin, these terms thick and thin, in origin and as Walzer uses them, those terms apply to kinds of description. One of the interesting things that happens in Thick and Thin is that Walzer allows for the possibility, even suggests the possibility, that thin is not the only alternative to thick. That there may be things about which we have little to say, about which we cannot offer a thick description, not because the things themselves are insubstantial, but because words simply don't suffice. Let me back up a moment and say, when he talks about thin moral arguments, he's talking mostly about negative statements that apply everywhere. He argues, I think pretty plausibly, that across cultures, there tends to be a prohibition against killing for no reason, or against what we could call murder. And he has other examples too. The more universal or close to universal a moral argument is, he says, the less there is to say about it. The less argumentative mileage you get from relying on it. Once you say it's wrong to kill, unless there's a really good reason, pretty much everybody is going to agree with that, culture to culture. But so what? It doesn't really, haven't really said very much. So that's what he means by a thin moral argument. At the end of his book, Thick and Thin, he makes a move which may sound at first like a contradiction to what he says in Spheres of Justice about the pluralistic recognition of human beings, and what he says in other writings in that decade about not wanting to write about human nature. At the end of Thick and Thin, he offers what he calls an account of the self, a kind of portrait of what a human self is. And he's very careful to say that he doesn't see this as a foundation for his argument in that book or elsewhere, but simply as an illustration of a way one might think about human selfhood that is compatible with his argument about political pluralism and his complex or pluralistic account of justice. So without going into all the details of that account of the self, the central idea is that we should see the self as composed of a variety of voices or influences. This is the pluralistic part. The different groups and memberships that may be part of who I am are all voices within myself. But at the center, he says, we should imagine a kind of a core self, not his term, but I think it fits, which is a listening self. He doesn't use the word silence, but the implication here is that at the center of a healthy, well-ordered self, however many influences and voices the self might incorporate, there's a still center of listening. This seems like something that is neither thick nor thin, can't be thickly described, but it is not, but not because it is unimportant or not substantive. In the same passage of that book, he uses the word mystery to describe selfhood, to describe the coherence and perdurance of the self. He uses the word just as a word, not as a concept. But it seems to me that if one takes the word mystery here as a concept, in the sense that theologians have used the term to mean something that we do not understand. I think this is a fair definition, something that we do not understand, but that we recognize as being worthy of our loyalty or worthy of being taken with absolute seriousness. If we take the word mystery in that sense, then Walzer has said something quite interesting here. He's said that an account of selfhood ought to include things that cannot be thickly described, but are of absolute importance because they are fundamental. So a substantial part of my paper then, and I'm not sure if I have time to talk about this in detail, Jeff, you tell me afterwards if I should go back and explain this more, is that I write a bit about some texts that I see as being just off stage from the writing of Spheres of Justice. What I mean by just off stage is that they are texts that Walzer clearly knows about, and that in one case he sort of directs his readers toward. While he's writing Spheres of Justice, a couple years before it's published, he publishes in Dissent, the magazine that he was co-editor of at the time, retired as editor just a few years ago. He publishes some excerpts from the writings of R.H. Tawney, the British historian who was as Walzer describes him, a Christian socialist, an Anglican to be precise. He publishes some quotations from Tawney's posthumously published journals, in which Tawney develops ideas that are, Walzer sees in Walzer's argument, a kind of a precedent for the way of thinking about justice that he develops in Spheres of Justice. Tawney, like Walzer, argues that the shared values of a society, even an unjust society, can be used to make an argument for justice within that society. But what Walzer doesn't quote, sometimes trimming his quotations from Tawney just at the precise sentence so as to miss this other theme, are the parts of his writings where Tawney is explicitly theological, where he invokes concepts like sin and grace. And as Tawney says, the idea that in order to believe in human equality, it is necessary to believe in God. So my way of looking at this is that when an author like Walzer, when an author does what Walzer does, to quote another author and leave some things unquoted, we should read those ideas as part of the context of what someone like Walzer is doing. They are the ideas just off stage. I want to read a little bit, since I don't think I can summarize it adequately without reading. I'm just going to read a little bit from the conclusion of my paper. After writing about what Tawney and Walzer's colleague, Irving Howe, says, the idea is off stage. I want to argue that around the edges of Walzer's writings, we might sense an idea something like the following, borrowing language here from Walzer, Tawney, and Howe. At the still center of our own experience of selfhood, we can recognize a mystery or a point of receptivity to mystery that could be called a soul. In other human persons, we can somehow, I'm not sure how, recognize reiterations of that same mystery, recognizing ensouled personhood as the fundamental thing that human beings have in common. We acquire a moral perspective that points to a politics of equality and solidarity. Because this moral perspective depends on a mystery rather than on knowledge, it cannot be shaken by incomprehensible events or political defeats. Thus, it can orient its adherents in their political activities and sustain their enduring political commitments. At the same time, these recognitions will be the recognitions will not provide a warrant for authority for one's arguments. A mystery cannot serve as a warrant of authority precisely because those who recognize it do not claim to understand it. And so a politics like Walzer's, which is a participatory politics, a politics of political engagement and organizing, needs some sort of orientation or moral sustenance, and a conception of the self like this could conceivably provide it. Walzer argues that political theorists ought not to look to the foundations of ethical concepts because he doesn't want political theorists to appeal to those foundations for authoritative arguments. What I think he implies or suggests or intimates is that we might instead look to the foundations of ethics, to something like this conception of ensouled personhood, for something that, for lack of a better term, I'm going to call orientation. Instead of looking to the foundations of ethics for authority, we might look to the foundations of ethics for orientation. And by orientation, I mean the sense of purpose or direction that one has in one's own political involvements that may be reiterated by other people, but that one doesn't see as a reason to claim authority over others. A participatory politics like Walzer's, any seriously democratic politics, socialist or otherwise, needs that sense of orientation. And I think that Walzer, maybe despite himself, maybe just writing with subtlety, I'm not sure, allows for that possibility of an appeal to ethical foundations for the sake of orientation. I think that in and around Walzer's writings, there are traces of a moral basis for socialism. It's a basis that happens to be rooted in biblical religion, although my argument here, and I don't think Walzer's argument either, would be that one cannot have a secular moral basis for egalitarian politics. Walzer's argument does happen to have those roots. Whether Walzer intends these traces and intimations in his writings, I do not know, but I think they are nevertheless there for his readers to find.
Okay, thanks very much, Jeff. Very interesting. Next, we'll hear from Nader Sadr from Hunter College. His paper is titled Charismatic Pirates, Reading the Odyssey with Max Weber. Nader, go ahead.
Thanks, Jeff. I just want to say I am fighting the impulse to want to ask Jeff a long list of questions. That was a terrific presentation, and it's the hardest thing for me to transition to something unrelated. This concept that you brought up about this idea that you can read from something and draw the line precisely where you feel like it deviates from your core commitments and then proceed forth. I think that's a very kind of generative way of thinking, and there are elements of it in the work that I'm trying to do. So I'm going to take that and pivot to this theme of travel. I am interested in this question of the politics of being in transit and of the identity of the traveler, and the politics that are produced by inhabiting transitory spaces. And I should say a little bit about what I mean by that. There has been a kind of a trend, I think, in the last 10 or 15 years to think more deeply about travel in political theory, political philosophy. And there are the approach that has been taken to this is an effort to kind of, what is appealing about thinking about travel in many cases is that it gives us a way of thinking about a way of being in which our attachments are loosened a bit, you might say, in which our identity attachments are less strong, and it thrusts us into a space in which we are kind of negotiating our identities. We're negotiating our position in a way that, for theorists, I think has an appeal because it has a sense of being a more purified political situation in a sense that I find in people like when I read Rancière and he has this kind of idealized style of politics or way of practicing politics. it is a vision of politics, a sort of an agonistic vision of politics that I think weds very nicely with the kind of the transitory experience of being a traveler. And so it has become a kind of, I think, appealing theme for people who want to try to conceptualize this kind of agonistic ideal of politics. It is not what has appealed to me, however, about travel. What I think the common characterizations of travel in political theory have tended to do is overemphasize the ways in which travel is a kind of a loosening of our attachments. And this seems to me to yield a kind of an impoverished understanding of politics. It's a style of politics that we achieve by abandoning our attachments, an unencumbered form of politics. And I think that this has been really useful in some cases. You think of someone like Roxane Euban, who has written about the ways in which cross-border transgressions bring people into contexts where knowledge can be produced, identity can be produced. It's a very kind of productive generative zone. And I think that this has been incredibly useful for shaking us free of the sense to which, identities become essentialized, let's say. What I think it leaves out, however, is what to me is so interesting about travel, which is the baggage that we are very rarely unencumbered. We are very rarely completely shaken loose of these commitments. And so what I wanted to do was try to think about travel as political in the sense of how it forces us to carry our attachments and our commitments into unfamiliar places, what we do when we are the host with the individual, the figure who comes into our zone and brings attachments, and how this sort of negotiation over commitments and attachments. And it's all in a sense motivated by this intuition that there's another kind of tendency when we think about the traveler, specifically when we think about the theme of hospitality, as thinking about it through kind of, for the lack of a better term, Christian terminology. That I think about someone like Derrida has written about hospitality, and I wouldn't say that he takes a kind of a maximalist Christian position, but I think he really forces us to think about, well, how is the commitment to hospitality anything less than maximal? And it has the effect of producing the traveler in this position of being maximally vulnerable. And I think in some cases, this is certainly understandable and valid, but it's not my experience of being a traveler, and it's not my experience of being a host. There is a certain kind of leverage, a certain set of capacities that travelers have that to me seem to have political effects. And I wanted to understand the traveler, therefore, as someone bearing political capabilities and having political effects, not having political effects by virtue of his or her claiming an identity as traveler. And so I wanted to think about the traveler as a kind of a dangerous figure, if you will. So this was the initial motivation. And as I'm thinking about this figure and the history of this figure of political thought, I'm thinking about the capabilities and the capacities that are unique to the traveler. And one of these is forms of travel speech, and specifically the travelogue. The travelogue as a genre of speech that belongs to the traveler, that produces political effects. And I think it's maybe important to qualify it. It's not so much that the traveler has this capacity. It's sort of like it's more that we can claim the identity of a traveler by speaking through this genre of travelogue. That I'm not making a sort of an empirical claim that there are some people who are travelers and these people speak through this genre. It's more that travelogue is a way in which we produce ourselves and we claim this identity as a traveler, and then that brings with it a certain set of political effects. So I wanted to understand how this worked and what kind of political effects it produced. And to me, the natural way to do this was to approach this question through literature. Literature, I guess, in quotes. And I want to kind of allude to this sort of the big methodological problem here without really going into it. But my interest is really less in kind of empirically demonstrating political effects of travelers and travel speech, and more to try to understand what I think of as sort of the social patterns that produce political effects. And in this case, it's the conventions that produce the travelogue, the expectations, if you will, of hospitality and the demands of hospitality and the reciprocity of hospitality that produces the travelogue. And then in turn, the political effects that flow from that. So I feel like this has been a sort of a somewhat long-winded and convoluted setup, but all of this brought me to Odysseus and to this speech that he gives to the Phaeacians. I'm sure if you're not familiar with the Phaeacian episode, the paper hopefully reminded you. But this is what in some cases is taken as the substance of the Odyssey itself, but this is his retelling of his sequence of events from leaving Troy to arriving basically at Ogygia, where he becomes sort of the captive of Calypso. And there's as you can imagine, there is a quite long and rich history of interpreting this episode. And, for everything from sort of this is a way in which Odysseus reclaims and reconciles his lost heroism with his identity that belongs to Ithaca. Some people have interpreted it as this kind of like sort of regenerative, restorative episode in which he is a war hero who needs to be kind of recuperated, and the Phaeacians supply the service so that he can then re-enter this war realm that Ithaca embodies. To me, what was compelling about the Phaeacian episode, however, was the ways in which you could read the Phaeacian episode as a social process productive of the story itself. So I was looking at the story for the ways in which it reflected the conditions that produced it. So now, before I get into that, the Odyssey, I think, it's a thick text, and this is what is to me so wonderful about working with it, is that it's endlessly generative interpretations, right? And there's a lot that can be pulled from it, and I'm sure a more gifted reader would be able to draw kind of a rich political reading just from the text itself. I'm not a sufficiently gifted reader, and so my solution is to draw upon the terms and categories of Weber to enliven and kind of enrich my interpretation of the politics of this episode. And in doing this, I think I'm stretching what Weber would have allowed us to do, I think, and I'm also kind of I'm drawing more from the text than I think a classicist might feel comfortable with. The intention is to yield a reasonably plausible reading of the Odyssey and a reasonably plausible reading of Weber that I hope enables us to not so much understand either of those texts with more clarity, although hopefully that is a happy byproduct, but to rather understand the politics of this genre of speech. And that's really my, if I have a sort of a target that I'm aiming towards, and a question that I'm trying to answer, it is what political effects are produced by travelogue. And I say that because I know that my readings are vulnerable, both of Weber and Homer. So with that said, I have a kind of a little thumbnail sketch of my paper that I'll just use to kind of run through the argument. But basically it goes like this. The story that Odysseus tells to the Phaeacians, in my view, I look at it as a motivated retelling. He recreates his experiences for the Phaeacians. And he does this both to address the interests of the king, tell us what you've seen, tell us who was a friend and who was a foe, who was law-abiding and who was a monster, tell us, in effect, where our enemies are and where our allies are. It's motivated in that sense substantively, and it's motivated in terms of the social convention to flatter his guests. In the course of producing his experiences for the Phaeacians, Odysseus also performs this kind of spatial production, I say. He produces two realms, two opposed realms, this kind of transitory realm of beasts and divinities, and kind of imbued with violence. And he produces it in opposition to this peaceful, tranquil, civilized realm of the Phaeacians. Interestingly, however, if now there's a scenario in which Odysseus as a speaker is merely another bard, which in a sense he is, but he is a different kind of bard. He is a bard who has also traveled. And so because of that, his speech has the effect not only of producing these realms, but of bridging the realms, of bridging the Phaeacians to this transitory realm that they have, in a sense, compelled Odysseus to draw into existence, to kind of rhetorically produce for them. So through his speech, he not only paints these realms, he draws the transitory realm to the Schereian shoreline. He sort of pierces this wall of invulnerability that the Phaeacians have thus far enjoyed, and draws the narrative therefore acquires a kind of immediacy that it would otherwise lack. His capacity to overcome the adversity that he depicts in transit, it takes on this added significance. Odysseus is not simply rescuing his crew from the Cyclops cave, he is implicitly rescuing the Phaeacians as well, who are drawn into this realm by virtue of his embodiment of this bridge between these realms. In doing so, he, I argue, draws himself into a kind of tacit comparison with the king, with Alcinous, whose fitness to rule heretofore, it's the fitness of any king is in part rooted in the ability to protect his people. His fitness now is suddenly, I argue, revealed to be contingent upon the isolation that the Phaeacians can no longer rely upon. The claim is really that Odysseus takes what prior to this story would have been this sort of unquestioned legitimacy of the Phaeacian king and draws boundaries around it and says, you hereditary monarch, you have legitimacy within this context, within this limited spatial realm. I'm going to connect you and your people to this wider realm, and I'm going to demonstrate your inadequacy within this broader realm. And in doing so, you are going to be diminished and I am going to be elevated. And we see this, this is demonstrated by Odysseus in his extraordinary capabilities to kind of master the circumstances that he finds within this transitory realm. So I think at this point, for me, this is the point in the text where I might continue to sort of speculate on the politics of this dynamic between the traveler and the king. But I think Weber at this point gives us useful categories and terminology for thinking about what is going on here. When Odysseus is redefining he's redrawing the map for the Phaeacians and redrawing the boundaries between the Phaeacians and the wider realm, and the effects that this has on their local political situation. And so my reading of Weber looks at, first, in the first case, the extraordinary capabilities that Odysseus demonstrates, which have the effect of undermining or destabilizing his patriarchal power. And then secondly, the extent to which this demonstration affects a kind of what I would call, and I'm kind of stealing his language here, but a reorientation, and what will eventually become a kind of a revolution in the hearts and the minds of the Phaeacians, away from patriarchal sources of authority to a new source of authority, in a capacity to reason. The idea, in a sense, is that Odysseus demonstrates his mastery over this transitory realm through his capacity to use human reason, through his cunning, through his guile, through his ability to come up with viable strategies to, at times, trick the divinities and the beasts. This is this extraordinary capability that he has, which enables him to, in a sense, steal both power from these extra moral figures, and to claim it for himself. What is, in a sense, we're still in kind of, this is familiar sort of, would be, I think, a familiar use of Weber in his understanding of how, for him, charismatic power would make an intervention into a condition of traditional patriarchal power. The charismatic figure who emerges from the group, who demonstrates a capacity, most frequently to wield magic, to gain some insight and to master a kind of a new threat. And in this way, undercuts the prevailing traditional authority. What is so fascinating, I find, about using Weber in the context of trying to make sense of what Odysseus does, is that you see an inversion of this role of magic. It's not Odysseus using magic to defeat adversaries, it's Odysseus using reason to defeat the magic of the beings that occupy this extra moral realm. And in doing so, he not only claims a kind of a new capacity and a power rooted in that new capacity, he also, in a sense, tacitly undermines the basis of authority, or the kind of not the basis of authority, it's the special distinction that the Phaeacians themselves hold, because the Phaeacians belong, at least partially, to this realm of extra mortals. And so this becomes a way in which he is able to kind of seize a kind of political power over and against his hosts, by virtue of this demonstration of this human quality, this human capacity. But there's another sense in which that Odysseus, I think, also complicates and stretches our understanding of Weber and his categories of at least the charismatic ruler in his relation to the traditional ruler. In Weber's formulation of it, the classic charismatic figure is the prophet. there are also, there are other kind of incarnations of this. There's the shaman, there's a pirate. But the most familiar version of Weber's charismatic ruler is this figure who emerges from the group itself, who assumes or who already is endowed with membership within the group. And this figure's stature comes from the capacity to see beyond whatever the horizon line is, to anticipate some future threat, and then whose magic is the demonstration of the capacity to master that anticipated threat. What I find happens in the Odyssey, conversely, is Odysseus is not only not a Phaeacian, he is almost of a different species. The Phaeacians are, kind of recent descendants of God. They have these sort of magical ships. They have this kind of endless bounty that emerges from the fields. They are closely connected with their divine ancestor. Odysseus is immortal, and he is non-Phaeacian in this kind of deep, profound way. And yet, because he speaks as a traveler, he is able to summon this, his capacity to summon, or his ability to demonstrate these capacities is linked to his very non-membership. And so I think the idea that I think comes through is, sorry, I'm rifling through 2 different pages of notes here. What Odysseus, I think, demonstrates is how travel can legitimize the charismatic ruler by providing her with the conditions to have the kind of insight that then becomes the basis for claiming authority. And what is interesting is the way in which I think it yields a kind of a disenchanted form of charisma, which is a funny inversion of to the Weberian concepts of disenchantment and charisma, and brings them together in a way that I had not contemplated before trying to apply this to Homer. I think ultimately my reading of this text ends without a clear kind of resolution. The application of Weber to this Phaeacian episode is, in a sense, there is no resolution in the sense of, there's no political resolution. There's no dethronement. Odysseus does not displace the king in any meaningful or substantive sense within the context of this episode. And the Phaeacians, above all, remain a kind of a magical people, and Odysseus remains immortal. I think there are indications that the king, Alcinous, feels threatened or at least insecure, but to push too hard on that, I think, reads too far into the text. What I do find compelling, however, is not that the revolutionary effects are demonstrated through the king, but rather they're demonstrated on the Phaeacians as a whole. And I try to make this point in the closing of the paper, but in effect, the Phaeacians give Odysseus this huge amount of treasure, and it's famous, it's more treasure than he takes from his adventures at Troy. And they agree to ferry him home. And Poseidon is outraged by this because he has cursed Odysseus for blinding Poseidon's son, Polyphemus the Cyclops, right? And so because of this, Poseidon effectively goes to Zeus, and together they decide, fine, destroy the Phaeacians. They have, in a sense, willingly taken on the curse of Odysseus. They have, in a sense, allowed themselves, through taking on that curse, allowed themselves to, I'm not sure what the right way to describe this is, but fallen into company with, allowed a certain amount of kindredship with. And I put it more boldly in the paper, but the bonds of kinship that define the Phaeacians are, in a sense, dissolved a bit and remade around the relationship with Odysseus. they in a sense, through his travelogue, a new kind of joint identity is formed, Odyssean Phaeacian. And for doing this, the Phaeacians are obliterated. Their ships are destroyed, and a boulder is dropped that bars them from the sea. And their identity as a seafaring people is erased. And I think that if I, in my more poetic moments, I think this is the lesson of the Phaeacian episode. If I read it through these Weberian terms, that if you want to undergo this revolution with a traveler, with a stranger, a new society is formed and a new identity is formed, but it comes at the cost of abandoning your old one. You cast yourself off into the same oblivion as the stranger who arrived. So yeah, as a kind of a metaphor for the political effects, I think Weber would enjoy it. Anyway, that's my paper. I appreciate your time, and I apologize if I got a bit long-winded in there. Thank you.
Thanks, Nader. Appreciate that. Finally, last but not least, we'll hear from Joanne Tetlow from Marymount University. Her paper is titled Executive Orders, Arbitrary Political Power, and Locke's Second Treatise. Take it away, Jo.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Thanks for being the chair and the discussant. And this is both those papers. I didn't read them. I have them in front of me. I glanced through them. They're imaginative and creative. And this paper is not that. It's legal and logical. So it's very different. Now I have a PowerPoint, and it's really about theorizing lawmaking. Let's see if that's not going to work. That's interesting. It's not working. Let's see. Let me try. Just a moment.
I'm always glad when the technical problems aren't on my end. Thank you, Jo.
I think, okay. Now it's not working again. Oh, there it goes. Okay, my thesis is substantive executive orders are presidential lawmaking and are thus unconstitutional. So substantive executive orders are presidential lawmaking and are thus unconstitutional. What are substantive executive orders? They're not administrative. Administrative orders are constitutional under Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, the Take Care Clause, where the president is charged with faithfully executing the laws passed by Congress. So what are substantive executive orders as I define it? It's when the president is using an Article 1 legislative power. So it's the nature of the power, whether it's legislative or executive, that's crucial. What are some examples? And this paper was going to be half Locke and half talking about the jurisprudence of executive orders. And it's really mostly Locke. I never really got there. Just there could be much longer lists, Truman, the steel seizure case, which I'll talk about, Youngstown, JFK creating the Peace Corps, Nixon created the EPA, George W. Bush creating the National Surveillance Program, Obama with the Immigration Memorandum, Trump and the travel ban. Okay, there is a lack of US Supreme Court jurisprudence on executive orders. That's one of the major problems. We have Youngstown, 1952 case, and really it's Justice Jackson's concurring opinion that's been reaffirmed in subsequent cases. And that's a tripartite test, a three-part test that has to do with the relationship between the president and Congress. Justice Black's much shorter majority opinion is one that I'm endorsing, because Black looks at the nature of the power, and Black says the seizure of the steel mills is a legislative power that the president is exercising, and thus it's unconstitutional. I talk a little bit about this, which I want to develop more. What did the founders, what was their view of executive power under Article 2? And these, again, mostly law review articles. Mortensen has a recent 2018 law review article where he goes through extensive Anglo-Saxon or English legal history and political theory to show that the founders thought executive power meant faithful execution only, nothing else. McConnell, who has a new book, I have it right here, which is excellent, The President Who Would Not Be King, says that no, the founders meant faithful execution, but more, plus. Defeasible power. So the general grant under Article 2 that the executive power vests in the president means more than just faithful execution. It means powers, but they're not prerogative powers. Defeasible powers means powers that can be limited by Congress. The president does have prerogative powers as commander-in-chief, and the pardon power, which cannot be touched by Congress, but the general grant in Article 2, McConnell thinks we should be worried about it because Congress can limit it. But it's a different view. And I think Locke basically thinks that the executive is to execute the law, and maybe a little bit more because Locke has a chapter on prerogative, but not much more. In either case, the founders had no intention of giving legislative power to the executive under Article 2, which I'm saying is substantive executive orders. We can go back to the case of proclamations where Lord Coke told King James I that he could not issue, we'll call it executive order, without consent of Parliament. And that's good law. 1611 case, we could say in the legal history, that's still good law. So the most recent scholarship about this issue, and it came up with Trump much more, have been law review articles, not as much in political science. So I'm trying to contribute by looking at Locke's second treatise. And there he is. And theorizing lawmaking and his emphatic insistence that it's a legislative power, not an executive power. So there are 3 points in the paper, according, this is in Locke's second treatise, that the legislative is supreme, that the legislative is limited, and that legislative is democratic. Does his chapter on prerogative change anything? No. One of the main themes in the second treatise is that Locke says no one has absolute arbitrary power over another because we're God's property. Only God can own us, and we still have freedom because God is not absolute and arbitrary in the way God exercises his power. And because we are God's property, no one can have that power over us. And that's what I'm suggesting substantive executive orders are. They're absolute and arbitrary. So under the first point that the legislative is supreme, I talk about Locke's theory. It's based on popular sovereignty or the consent of the governed. That's why the legislative is supreme, because it represents the people. We've given that power, that consent. And Locke also talks about it as a sacred and unalterable, in the sense that we image God in our lawmaking power. God is the great legislator for Locke and the great judge and the great executive. And so this is a sacred type power when we exercise lawmaking, and thus it can't be changed by the executive. And then thirdly, Locke says that whoever has this supreme legislative power, that determines what kind of commonwealth you have, whether it's a democracy or aristocracy or a monarchy. And the second point is that the legislative is limited. Even though it's supreme, it's limited. Its purpose is to pass settled, standing, declared laws. He says this a lot in the second treatise, which is the opposite of absolute arbitrary power, and he defines it as such. So settled, standing, we have notice, they're standing, the public knows about them, they're declared, they have this stabilizing effect on a society, and that's what lawmaking is, legislative lawmaking. So I talk about that. And then Locke's non-delegation doctrine, which he says the legislature cannot transfer that lawmaking power to anyone, non-delegation. And I was happy to see Justice Gorsuch actually quote Locke in a recent dissent in Gundy v. United States that was about the non-delegation doctrine. And the last point is that the legislative is democratic. So what if absolute arbitrary power is exercised by the legislative branch, the judiciary, or the executive? And of course, for Locke, the judiciary is part of the legislative. At that time, the House of Lords was the final court of appeals. Anytime this type of power is exercised, the people have a right to dissolve the government. And he gives two sets of grounds for this dissolution: executive interference in the legislative, or just a general breach of fiduciary trust, which is a lower standard to me, kind of a general breach of trust, which of course, I'm saying that a substantive executive order would meet both of those grounds. So I want to mention here, why the people have this power to dissolve the government. Yes, popular sovereignty, but let's look specifically, what political power did individuals have in the state of nature? What did they give up when they left the state of nature? Well, they had no legislative power in the state of nature. The law of nature governs the state of nature. And Locke is this foundational thinker where the law of nature, natural law, does a lot of work in his theory. So he wouldn't, Walzer, he's kind of thinker Walzer probably, I haven't read Walzer very much, would disagree with. So we didn't have any legislative power in the state of nature. We had executive power and we had judicial power. And so when we leave the state of nature, we wholly give up the executive. We didn't have any legislative to give up to begin with. And we partially, I'm saying, give up the judicial power. This right to judge that we reserve in political society and government is the right to judge. There's a breach of trust, or the political compact has been broken and people decide we need to dissolve the government. That's where the right to judge is. So it's a reserved judicial power. We don't act like a court when we're in political society and government, but it's this right to judge that we have in our hands. And so the way Locke describes like an absolute monarchy is, and I'm suggesting here, the president's doing this is, like Stalin. It's kind of overstated, but to be under an absolute monarch is worse than the state of nature. At least in the state of nature, we had our own executive power. Now we've wholly given it up. And now we have an executive acting absolute and arbitrarily. Locke calls that despotic power. He has a chapter on slavery that would go into the category of slavery. So we're even a worse position, and no rational person would do that. So I'm trying to get to the point is how important this is, how significant it is, and nothing's being done about it. The Supreme Court is not doing anything, and they need to. So I'm saying substantive executive orders are an exercise of absolute arbitrary power and unconstitutional. What is the remedy? For Locke and his parliamentary system, you dissolve the government and create a new legislative. And I suggest in our separation of power system, the Supreme Court needs to step in and exercise judicial review. The last two slides, the last slide is, well, what about prerogative power? And there we have Charles II, who was the monarch when Locke was writing the second treatise. Well, I'm saying that this is not change. This doesn't change anything, because even prerogative power is only the power to act. It's not the power to make laws in Locke and in the founder's conception. And it's still limited by constitutionalism and the public good. It's a discretionary power the executive uses when he has to. It's not extra constitutional. It's still subject to legislative supremacy. So I'm suggesting this is not a problem for this argument that someone would make the argument that these kind of executive orders are under prerogative power. Okay, that's it.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Appreciate that. All right, so I have a few comments that I'll make in the order of the panel's presentations. And then hopefully after I'm done, we'll have a little bit of time. I'll try to be relatively brief. So I think this panel ends at 12:15. So we've got about a little under 20 minutes to do this. So I'll raise some interesting points, try to give a quick summary of each thinker, each paper as I go through them. So let me start with Jeff Kurtz's paper on Michael Walzer. Kurtz points out an interesting tendency in Michael Walzer's work to sometimes obliquely gesture in the direction of some foundational ethical appeal. These gestures hover at the edge of Walzer's approach. Walzer is understandably uncomfortable making a clear metaphysical appeal, but in glossing or quoting writers who do make this sort of appeal, Kurtz points out, as well as in a few elusive gestures of his own, he implies a potential usefulness and appeal, and maybe even the necessity of such background apparatus. But here we have a problem or a paradox, as Kurtz points out. On the one hand, Walzer doesn't want kind of a Goethean thick description for foundational ethical appeals. Thick descriptions are inevitably too context specific. At the same time, Walzer thinks thin description is too minimal and needs other sorts of support. The dilemma more concretely is, we need such an appeal for support, but the moment we make it explicit, we tend to divide rather than unite. In the broad sense, this is just sort of the dilemma of philosophy in the 20th century, or at least since Nietzsche, right? Now, where this leaves us, I'm less than sure, right? I don't know if I was thinking the whole time when you were writing about this, about Stephen White's book, Sustaining Affirmation, Strengths of Weak Ontology and Political Theory, and his idea of a light metaphysical footprint. But maybe you can say more about where you're thinking of going with this. And I think, in your paper, Jeff, you also gesture towards the possibility of civic membership orientation, vanishing sort of thing that Putnam's Bowling Alone or Skocpol's Diminished Democracy chronicles in an American context. So maybe you can kind of put those things together. But more specifically, the talk of souls and the references to more explicitly ecclesiastically oriented texts in Walzer's writing also makes me think of parallels to this in the communitarian tradition writ large. And I know Walzer is uncomfortable being put in that tradition, but I'm going to bypass his concern about that for a moment, stick him in there, right? So think about some of Walzer's rough communitarian contemporaries, using this term rather loosely, who also make this kind of religious appeal, sometimes very, very lightly, sometimes more heavily. On the light side, someone like Charles Taylor, Anglicanism is never far from the edges of his thought. And, more heavily, someone like MacIntyre, Alistair MacIntyre, and whatever his kind of revised version of Catholicism is. So I guess, my point about this is that, in the communitarian tradition, Walzer has a lot of company in posing this problem. And I'm wondering if you're planning on kind of bringing in some of those contrasts, because that might kind of situate, Walzer a little bit more if you put him into conversation with other people that are doing this sort of thing. And then of course, there's the broader tradition about this, right? This kind of appeal to these sorts of foundations, either lightly or heavily, go all the way back to Plato, right, with the myth of Ur and the noble lie. So I'm also thinking about kind of contextualizing Walser a little bit more within that tradition as well. Now, turning towards the end of your paper in this concept of mystery, I thought a lot about that. I thought it was really interesting. I hadn't considered that in the context of Walser before. So I'm wondering, what kind of work this term obscures. Kurtz, Jeff, you say, a mystery can be is on page 17. A mystery can be the moral basis for a political commitment in the sense that it orients and sustains those who recognize it. And I guess I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about the difference between orientation and foundations. That seems a little obscure or mysterious to me, right? More concretely, we can ask some really basic questions about this, about a mystery. What do we do about people who don't recognize the mystery? How do we get people to recognize it? What about people whose understanding of what the mystery signifies or what it means or how it plays out in the political world? What if it's different from our own? These aren't, mysterious questions. And then I guess even more generally, and this just occurred to me when you were talking through your paper, you said something about how it's difficult to put the mystery into language. And I guess, sort of generally, I'm always a little bit skeptical about that. We hear this from our students a lot, or I hear this from my students a lot. Oh, I can't put it into words. I can't put it, and I say, try. And they often can once they try to do it a little bit. Poets are very good at this, political theorists, maybe not so good, but, trying to articulate it, it's often possible to articulate. And sometimes I suspect that the refusal to articulate it means that there's not something there. If you can't articulate it in language, what is it? How does it function? This is a deep question. Turning to Nader's paper, Charismatic Travelers, which I really enjoyed. The Odyssey is one of my favorite texts. So it was a lot of fun to kind of dive into that. It was a nice distraction from my work this semester. So Sader reads Odysseus' stay in Phaeacia and Homer's Odyssey through the lens of Weber's description of the charismatic king. Odysseus' narrative in Sader's reading destabilizes and challenges Alcinous' authority. Odysseus' narrative techniques in his description of how he overcomes various challenges in his travels present an alternative to Alcinous' hereditary form of rule, one based on rationality and skill, which Sader says, interestingly, I think points towards a democratic politics, since presumably these are skills anyone, not just hereditary rulers, can acquire and deploy. I really, really, really like the fact that, Jeff, Nader, that you bring up the fact that there's a lot of tension between Odysseus and his hosts, which I think is often downplayed or overlooked entirely in commentaries, which frequently focus, as you point out, on the responsibilities enacted by guest-host relationships, right? So typically, you read Alcinous' and Odysseus' interactions on this front as a model of this kind of really important Greek norm, the guest-host relationship. I also like the emphasis on the constructed nature of Odysseus's narrative, right? And that's kind of what I want to kind of push a little bit here, and because I think there's some resources there that maybe you can rely on to build your argument up a little bit more in terms of the text. The constructed nature of Odysseus's narrative. Odysseus is a constructor, the beginning of the Odyssey, anermoi and epimusa, polutropon hos malapola, polutropos, right? This word that's associated with, this adjective that's associated with Odysseus, many-wayed, it's usually translated, right? Odysseus is above all skilled at deception and stealth, and much of what he tells the Phaeacians may not only be narrowly tailored for their concerns, but, may be entirely made up, right? I'm being a little bit provocative here, but I think there's a lot in the text that bears this out. So I want to offer a few extensions and questions about your narrative of the text here, and mostly relating to things that point to this tension between Alcinous and Odysseus. On page 7, you say that there's little drama, right, on Odysseus's first day in Phaeacia, but I'm actually not so sure about that, right? Odysseus appears not just as kind of a washed up traveler, but also as a potential suitor for Alcinous' daughter, Nausicaa. She gives him clothing that she's taken to wash. Presumably they're men's clothing, presumably they're clothing from the royal household. They may be Alcinous' or one of Nausicaa's brothers, right? Nausicaa goes down to sure to do laundry. And this is also an indication that she's of marriageable age and ready to think about finding a husband. When she comes back to the city, so does Odysseus, right? This may be welcome or unwelcome to Alcinous, but it certainly presents him with the form of a dilemma. What do you do with this guy who's probably in your household clothes that your daughter has clearly brought back home? And, who is he? Does he pose a threat? And note that Odysseus, instead of, in following Nausicaa's instructions, she says, go to the palace and prostrate yourself before my mother, right? So Odysseus kneels down before Arete, not Alcinous. Alcinous is the king, right? This isn't a major breach of manners, but it has prompted a lot of discussion in some commentaries which tend to look for the origins of a matriarchy here, right? In Phaeacia, right? So Arete is also the wife. The mother is also the character who first argues that Odysseus should be given gifts. And Alcinous doesn't really go along with this, but first reasserts his authority to make this decision, following one of his chief advisors who does it as well. So Alcinous on this reading faces challenges not just from Odysseus, but maybe prompted by Odysseus some challenges from Arete, right? So there are multiple convergences on Alcinous's authority here. Perhaps the differences between the husband and the wife are over the suitability of Odysseus as a son-in-law. Perhaps the authority or the problem is just female authority, perhaps some kind of combination of both. I think we can also think of some of Odysseus's narratives in terms of this tension. So think about his narrative of the Cyclops. Now, usually, and Nader goes over this in his paper, this is read as a comparative morality tale in terms of the guest-host relationships. The Cyclops are the ultimate in bad hosts, right? While the Phaeacians get read as their positive counterpoint. But if you look again, there are other sorts of valences in this story, right? Remember, and I think Sauter pointed this out in the presentation, the Phaeacians are relatives to the gods in this tradition, in the same way that Cyclops and giants are. In fact, they're related to the Cyclops and giants, right? And in the mythological tradition, which is probably part of the background that a hearer of this text in the ancient world would have, right? The Cyclops attack the Phaeacians, and that's why the Phaeacians have to move to Scheria away, right? So in telling the story of successfully defeating Polyphemus, Odysseus is also saying that he did what Alcinous's ancestors failed to do, defeat the Cyclops, right? So this is a challenge. And you can add in the bit about them being related maybe as well. As kind of a minor aside on this question of the Cyclops narrative, you note in your paper that the Cyclops episode shows Odysseus as having extraordinary or exemplary strength. This is on page 18. I'm not sure that's right. And this is a minor matter, right? But Odysseus doesn't defeat the Cyclops in a test of strength. His victory is better described as skill and deception, sneakiness. It's brave, it's courageous, certainly, but probably not strength. Odysseus isn't generally known for his strength in contrast to people like Achilles and Aeneas. Those are the big, butch, powerful guys, right? So on the one side, you have that sort of threat. And on the other side, there are some things, some resources in the text that I think you can point to that indicate that Alcinous is really aware of this potential threat. So in book 8, around line 300, in response to Odysseus's challenge to compete physically with the Phaeacians to show off his skill, Alcinous immediately withdraws the Phaeacian claim to excellence in more aggressive sports like boxing and wrestling. And he avoids any references to throwing the discus, which Odysseus has already done, right, successfully. He seizes instead on two untested areas in which the Phaeacians might claim superiority, running and sailing. Now, Odysseus has said, oh, my legs might be weak because I'm in this kind of shipwrecked condition. And the fact that he's shipwrecked kind of indicates he might not be that great of a sailor, right? So here are the two ways in which Alcinous says, oh, maybe we can compete with you here, right? So there's tension there. And then some things are a little more oblique, like, there's a famous passage in book 11 where Alcinous turns to Odysseus and says, and I'll just read the quote. This is Emily Wilson's translation. Alcinous says, Odysseus, the earth sustains all different kinds of people. Many are cheats and thieves who fashion lies out of thin air, but not when I look at you. I know you're not in that category. Now, you can tell from my reading of that what I want to do with it, right? This raises the question, is Odysseus lying? Does Alcinous think he's lying? Now, ostensibly, on the face of it, he's saying, no, you're not a liar, right? But the fact that he brings this up raises it up to the level of kind of questioning the text. So maybe he's accusing Odysseus of being a liar. liar. So then stepping back a bit to, the more general approach in the text, which I'm glad you talked about in the introduction to your remarks here. I take it this looks like a book project here. So I'm curious about what else you're using to kind of contextualize these travel arguments, which I think are very interesting, right? So you mentioned Rancière and Roxane Euban stuff on Islam and travel, but are you going back, since you're using Odysseus, are you going back to the ancient world for other things? Are you using Herodotus? Are you stopping midway to the 20th century with Montesquieu and the Persian letters? That's all sort of stuff that I'd be interested in hearing about what you're doing. And then even more generally, I guess, I like this idea of carrying our attachments into other places and having that present a sort of challenge. I'm wondering if that has also sort of a domestic application. How separate is travel from just difference? When I go around the United States, there are places where I really feel very much like a traveler. And sometimes they're just in the next neighborhood over. I feel like a traveler. I'm talking with some of my neighbors. So how much of this kind of moves over into just general dealing with the question of difference? How much of it is reliant on travel per se? We could talk more about that. I think there's a lot going on in the Odysseus episode in Phaeacia. You're probably aware of a lot of the criticisms about this. I think it can be really used productively. There's a lot more tension there than I think you've given credit for. Let me turn finally to Joe's paper. Also very interesting. Sorry, I'm skimming through this quickly just to have a little chance for some discussion.
And by the way, I do think we should let our guests ask a question first because we're almost out of time.
Okay, well, I can do that. I can postpone.
No, well, now I do want to hear your comments.
Well, you know what, Joe? I can actually also email them to you.
Okay, because she's been sitting there for almost an hour.
And maybe you guys want to mix it up a little bit. So, Joe, why don't I do that? Why don't I email my comments to you? And
yes.
Then our guest, Dr. Alapo, did you have any questions?
No, I actually don't. Thank you very much.
Okay.
That was a
good.
nice panel discussion, and I did gain a lot from your paper presentation. Thank you.
Good, thanks. Well,
I just felt like I wanted to ask her, but it's up to you, Jeff, however you want to proceed.
No, I think it's fine. We've got only a couple minutes left. I don't need to monologue. Why don't you guys, are there things that you want to ask each other, or things that you want to respond to from what I said, or why don't you guys go ahead?
I had actually a lot of questions. I really enjoyed both papers, and if I could just take a few seconds.
Go.
So Jeff, what I was reminded of reading your paper, I wondered if you had looked at Jeremy Waldron's book about, doesn't he have a book about egalitarianism and the Christian roots of egalitarianism? And I should have gone back to it before asking this question, but I was thinking of it because my recollection is that Waldron writes about these Christian roots of egalitarianism specifically as they pertain to Locke. And I thought that it would be so interesting. I was wondering if, because to bring Locke into conversation with Walzer creates all of these tensions. And it seems compelling to me, are there common Christian roots in their egalitarianism that can somehow yield this sort of possessive individualistic idea or sort of direction in Locke, and a democratic socialist vision in Walzer? And I don't know, I wondered if there was any kind of either latent similarities that I was not aware of between Locke and Walzer and those traditions, or if, I don't know, I guess I'm wondering how that common foundation might have yielded such disparate outcomes. I don't know, I don't want to monopolize the conversation though, so I'll stand down.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know Waldron's book. I'll look. Thank you.
No, I have that book. I did mine. Right.
Yeah, I had
it's
questions.
the same thing the Declaration says, God created us, we're all equal before God.
Right.
So it's developed, but that's where it comes from.
Jeff, do you want to get in?
I had questions for both of you, and I don't know, again, like this, if we had another hour. So just quickly, one question for each of you. So I'm trying to sort through my notes and see where I wrote these down. Nader, I was thinking about the difference between, you've decided to write about Odysseus, that's clear, but whether it makes a difference that Odysseus is a traveler on his way home, rather than a traveler going somewhere entirely new. Because in my mind, at least, travel stories fall into those two main categories. I could add more, but that was one of the things that occurred to me. And Joe, it sounded to me, my question for you is, it sounded to me like, thinking about the Justice Black and Justice Jackson's arguments, we could say that the Constitution defines three types of power, or we could say that the Constitution defines three institutions and their relations among one another. And obviously it does both, but it seems like in deciding which way to read the constitutionality of executive orders, you're deciding that the definition of three types of power is more important than the definition of three institutions and their relations. And I'm wondering why you would choose, on what basis we could decide which of those two things the Constitution does is more important.
Yeah, that's a good question. What are we gonna do? You want me to?
What, while there's a gap, sorry, were you going to say something, Joe?
Well, I was just gonna say, I know that, when they were deciding where to allocate the power under the three articles, that a lot of the powers that Congress has were prerogative powers that the king had. So they gave the legislative Congress executive powers, and they were in the Confederal, under the Confederal Congress too, like the power to coin money, et cetera. So I know what you're talking about. Separated institutions sharing power, or I think we have a problem. So, I have to think about that. I think there is, obviously the president's veto is a share in a legislative power, but I'm arguing it's the lawmaking power that is the fundamental, and that's what keeps us in constitutional government. And that's a power that is, maybe some are shared, but that's one that cannot be shared. I guess that's mine.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in, Joe, I also enjoyed your paper, but at the risk of sounding incredibly naive, the question that I walked away from it with was, I guess it didn't feel clear to me where the line was between lawmaking and executive action. And
Right.
it felt to me like, well, does the problem not just then shift to who gets to make judgments about what is lawmaking, and it's sort of this, what the decision procedures are for determining where that line is. And I was wondering, like, is there not some example, some sort of like, here we see, I wanted a line. I wanted to see how these judgments might be made.
Right.
Because to me, lawmaking there's shades of it.
Can I echo that in the sense that I thought, maybe you needed to refine your definition of substantive as well, right? Which I get the idea of it, right? But it seems like it needs a lot more precision in the paper.
Well, I do think that's a difficult line to draw. What could Congress, is this something Congress can do under the Constitution? That's what Black said in his opinion. And if it is, then it's not an executive, it's a legislative power. But I agree that that's going to be, and I just think the Supreme Court needs to start developing some jurisprudence around this. I don't know if I have the exact answer, but yeah, I'm saying that the court is the one who needs to do something. And it's really undeveloped since Youngstown, more or less. They just defer. And I think it's a major problem. Anyway, thank you. And time. I was wondering, Nina, if you thought, I was thinking of Tocqueville when you were Tocqueville with your paper.
Yeah, I suppose a lot of my dissertation research was on travel. And once you start reading for this theme, it's everywhere. But it's everywhere. And it's not all, the tradition of using travel is stronger when there's a strong kind of philosophical tradition that travel is an experience that endows a kind of desituated knowledge that has a universal purchase. And there's a kind of intuitive appeal to that. I mean, you find that everyone from Plato to Machiavelli are brawls in a certain sense. And that's really what I'm trying to I wanted to really push against that use of perhaps in a Waltzerian kind of vein. Sorry.
Thank you. The question I have for Jeff, and I see where is the idea of the soul, does that have a transcendent dimension? Or is it just immanent? Is it just the soul within man and no divine transcendent connection?
I think in the sources that Walzer invokes, it has a transcendent dimension. I mean, that's the background, but he leaves that in the background. But yeah, that's the sort of concept that he's invoking, if not employing, or evoking. I'm not sure which of those two words I mean. They're not quite the same thing, are they?
Okay, so I know we're running out of time. Jeff, I wanted to ask you about Walzer. You're talking about potentially Christian roots. I wondered if he has the book on Exodus, and then he has that other book, In God's Shadow, I think it's called. Yeah. I wondered if either of those books had been useful. I read the Exodus book years ago. I loved it, but I can see why it wouldn't be that useful. But I was wondering if those are explicitly biblical readings, right?
Yeah, and he's more recently been involved, well, actually not just recently, they just recently began publishing series of volumes that he's co-edited called The Jewish Tradition of Political Thought, or Jewish Political Thought. I think that's the title. It's with anthologies with commentaries. So he's, over the past few decades, increasingly written about biblical and religious themes, but in a way that somehow avoids engaging with the sort of the theological substance of the biblical religious traditions. That's the best short reply I could give. It's another kind of puzzle in his writings. Why does he write about this and not this?
Well, folks, are there any other comments that people would like to make, or?
I just wanted to thank you, Jeff, for the comments and for all your work in doing this.
My pleasure. Thanks for the papers. It was fun to read them. Like I said, a welcome break from student papers this time of year. A very welcome break. All right. Well, good. Then I will draw this panel discussion to a close. Thank you all for presenting. Hopefully the recording worked. We'll get it archived. If you want to go watch yourself present, you can go back and revisit the moment. And otherwise, I'll see you guys all at future conferences, and I look forward to reading the published version of these papers. Right.
Thank you.
Take care.
Everyone. Take care.